10 years. 10 long years have passed since that fateful night. It feels like a lifetime ago, yet the memories are as vivid as if it happened yesterday. 10 years since that night. The night that changed everything. The night that left an indelible mark on my soul.
Thomas Doyle gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more troubling than the last. The mountain road twisted ahead, shrouded in fog. It was as if the road itself was a metaphor for his life, uncertain, winding, and fraught with danger. Each curve brought a shiver down his spine, a tremor of dread he couldn't shake. The fog seemed to close in on him, suffocating, relentless.
The old guilt gnawed at me, sharp and relentless. It was a constant companion, a shadow that never left my side. I thought I could outrun it, bury it deep. I thought that if I drove far enough, fast enough, I could leave it all behind. But the past has a way of catching up, especially in a place like this. The rearview mirror was a constant reminder of the darkness that followed me.
A chill wind howled outside, rattling the truck's windows. It was as if the very elements were conspiring against him, urging him to confront his past. Thomas pressed on, his heart pounding in sync with the rhythm of the wipers. Each swipe of the wipers seemed to clear away a layer of his resolve, exposing the raw nerves beneath. He was drawn back, compelled to face the demons that haunted him. The road ahead was a journey into his own soul, a confrontation with the ghosts of his past. The road seemed endless, each mile a struggle against the encroaching darkness. It was a battle he had to fight, a journey he had to complete.
This time there would be no turning back. I'd come too far, faced too much to retreat now. This time, I would find my peace. Or so I hoped. The dawn was breaking, and with it, a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this winding road would lead to a place of solace.
10 years ago, the world was a blur of reckless youth and cheap beer. Thomas, barely a man, had been driving that same mountain road, his laughter echoing in the night. He'd had too much to drink, ignoring the warnings in his head.
Then, a figure appeared in the headlights, a tall, gaunt shape in a long coat. The brakes screeched, the truck skidded, metal screaming against the guardrail.
Thomas blacked out, the image of the figure seared into his memory. When he woke, the figure was gone. The police found no evidence of another person. Just an accident, they said. But Thomas knew what he had seen, and he couldn't escape the guilt, the gnawing suspicion that he had hurt someone that night. The years that followed were a blur of self-destruction. Thomas carried the weight of that night, the unknown fate of the figure haunting his every move. He had become a ghost himself, drifting through life, seeking solace in the bottom of a bottle.
But something had changed recently. A newfound clarity, a desperate need to make things right. I had to go back. I had to find out what happened that night.
The road stretched before him, a tangible manifestation of his journey to redemption. With each passing mile, the fog seemed to thicken, mirroring the turmoil in his soul. The mountain loomed, a silent sentinel guarding its secrets. He was nearing the spot, the place where it all went wrong. As he neared the bend in the road, the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy. A low whisper seemed to dance on the wind, a faint, mournful sound.
I pulled over, the engine sputtering into silence. The silence was deafening, broken only by the creaking of the truck's cooling metal.
He stepped out, the cold, damp air clinging to him like a shroud. His eyes scanned the road, searching for any sign, any clue. There, in the distance, something flickered in the fog. A tall, shadowy figure just out of reach. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath catching in his throat.
Could it be? Was it possible? He took a step forward, then another, drawn toward the figure like a moth to a flame.
Doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Was this real, or was his guilt playing tricks on him?
The fog swirled around him, obscuring his vision, playing with his senses. The figure remained elusive, moving with an unnatural grace, always just out of reach.
Thomas pressed on, his pace quickening, his fear turning to a strange sort of determination.
He had to know. He deserved to know.
As he approached the spot where the accident happened, the figure stopped. It turned, slowly, deliberately. The fog seemed to part, revealing a face he knew, a face that haunted his dreams. It was the figure from that night, the night that had haunted his dreams and turned his waking hours into a living nightmare. The same gaunt features, the same piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through him. Those eyes, filled with an unspoken accusation, had never left his mind. Time seemed to stand still. The world around him faded into insignificance, leaving only the two of them in a suspended moment of confrontation. The only sound was the frantic beating of his own heart. It echoed in his ears, a relentless reminder of his fear and guilt.
The figure didn't speak. It stood there, a silent sentinel, its presence more powerful than any words could be. It just stared at him, an accusatory silence that spoke volumes. The weight of that gaze was almost unbearable, pressing down on him like a physical force.
Thomas felt a cold dread grip his soul, a feeling of inescapable doom. It was as if the very air around him had turned to ice, freezing him in place. He tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but the words caught in his throat. His mouth moved, but no sound emerged, his voice stolen by the overwhelming fear. The figure took a step toward him, and Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Each step the figure took seemed to echo in the silent forest, amplifying his terror. He wanted to run, to escape the chilling gaze of those eyes, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. It was as if invisible chains held him in place, binding him to his past. He was trapped, ensnared by his own guilt and fear. The weight of his past mistakes bore down on him, leaving him powerless and paralyzed in the face of his own demons.
You can't hide from the past, Thomas.
The voice, when it came, was a low, raspy whisper, as cold and unforgiving as the grave. Thomas stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror. The figure advanced, its movement slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey.
I didn't see you, I swear, I didn't see you.
The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The figure stopped in front of him, its face inches from his own.
You left me to die, Thomas, and now it's your turn.
Thomas felt a surge of panic, a primal fear that threatened to consume him. He turned to run, but the figure grabbed him, its grip icy and strong. The fog thickened around them, shrouding the world in a suffocating blanket of gray. Thomas's breath came in ragged gasps, each one a desperate attempt to draw in air that seemed to grow thinner by the second. Thomas struggled in vain, his heart pounding against his ribs. His muscles burned with the effort, but the figure's grip was unyielding. Panic surged through him, a wild, uncontrollable force that threatened to consume him entirely. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, a chill that went beyond the physical, reaching into the very core of his being. He looked into the figure's eyes, pleading for mercy, for understanding, but found only cold, empty darkness. Those eyes, devoid of any warmth or compassion, seemed to pierce through him, seeing into the depths of his soul. Thomas's pleas turned to sobs, his voice breaking as he begged for release, for some semblance of humanity in the face of this relentless terror.
No. His scream echoed through the fog, a raw, primal sound that seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive mist. It was a cry of defiance, of desperation, but also of resignation, as if some part of him already knew that escape was impossible.
Thomas cried, his voice raw with terror. Tears streamed down his face, mingling with the dampness of the fog. He could feel his strength waning, his will to fight slipping away with each passing moment. The figure's grip tightened, and Thomas knew that he was losing this battle. But it was too late. The realization hit him like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him. There was no escape, no salvation. The fog seemed to close in around him, a living entity that sought to consume him whole. The figure pulled him close, its touch draining the warmth from his body. Thomas shivered uncontrollably, his teeth chattering as the cold seeped deeper into his flesh. He could feel his life force ebbing away, drawn out by the figure's icy embrace. Thomas felt himself slipping away, his vision fading, the world dissolving into a swirling vortex of fog and shadows. His limbs grew heavy, his thoughts sluggish. The fight was leaving him, replaced by a numb acceptance of his fate. The last thing he saw was the figure's eyes, burning with a cold, malevolent fire, and he knew that his last ride had come to an end. Those eyes, so full of malice, would haunt him in his final moments, a reminder of the darkness that had claimed him. The mountain road stretched on, silent and empty, swallowed by the encroaching fog. It was as if the world itself had been erased, leaving nothing but an endless expanse of gray. The road, once a symbol of freedom and possibility, now seemed like a path to nowhere. The only sound was the mournful whisper of the wind, carrying with it the echoes of a past that refused to be forgotten. It was a haunting melody, a reminder of what had been lost, and of the darkness that now reigned supreme. The wind's lament was a fitting requiem for Thomas, a final, sorrowful note in the symphony of his life. The next morning, the fog had lifted, revealing a scene of eerie tranquility. The truck stood abandoned by the side of the road, its doors flung open, the engine cold. Inside, the remnants of a life cut short lay scattered on the dashboard, an empty flask, a crumpled pack of cigarettes, a faded photograph of a younger, happier Thomas Doyle.
But of Thomas himself, there was no sign. The mountain had claimed him, just as it had claimed countless others before him. And the wind whispered through the trees, a haunting reminder that some debts could never be repaid, some sins never forgiven. The last ride of Thomas Doyle was over, but his story, like the fog that clung to the mountain, lingered on.